Teachers of Reddit, what is the weirdest excuse you've ever heard that turned out to be true?
We had a kid in our class who was pure chaos. Came late all the time, forgot stuff, didn't do his homework, disruptive in class, you get the picture. One day he came to school over 2 hours late and said the bus he was on fell into a sinkhole. Everybody was like, yeah, right, until the news came in that there had indeed been a sinkhole from a tunnel construction and that indeed a bus had slipped into it. We never found out whether our classmate had actually been in it, but he swore he was.
That their homework had been confiscated by Colonel Gaddafi's police. Turns out the kid's father worked for a Libyan bank, and the homework was about aerosols. Kid had gone to visit him during the summer break, and it was taken by the border guards. Muammar Gaddafi ate my homework. I had a 6th grader come into class very sleepy during test day. I asked her why and she said she is sleeping next to her dead grandma in the living room and has been too scared to sleep. I asked her parents about this. Turns out it's a cultural practice of theirs to keep a dead relative in the home for a few days while their spirit makes its journey to the afterlife. To answer some of your questions, she was from a large Hmong family that lived in a small apartment. She also mentioned before the grandmother passed her family attached bells to the grandmother's clothing to scare away the spirits that were making her sick. Okay, that's enough Reddit for today. Missing class because my grandmother died. I heard it 3 times from the same student. I heard it from her twice freshman year, which was pretty suspicious, and once her junior year. I asked our principal, turns out all 3 were legit and one of her grandmothers was from a second marriage. I have like 7 people I call grandma. Would be 8 but one is such a bitch I refer to her by her first name. Family trees get real weird real quick. I have to attend a reception at the White House Rose Garden. Ha, yeah, and I have to attend a reception at the White House White Garden. Me, the teacher, didn't make cookies for the last day of school before finals as promised because a car drove into my house and they cut off my gas line to check for leaks. I pulled up the local news article as evidence. A teacher at our school promised to make cookies the last day of school, but his baby was born the night before. That was freshman year. It is senior year now, and the teacher still gets asked about the cookies. My cousin took my homework on vacation to Venezuela. My student teacher for my speech class took our homework to Mardi Gras, and his suitcase got stolen. So everyone got an A for the assignment. Thanks Mr. Cocker. My pet rats dragged my history homework into their cage and modified it to fit in with the aesthetic of their shredded paper nest. I told the teacher the next day, who didn't believe me until I could get my dad to vouch for me. Teach was all well if she wasn't lying, why didn't she bring the remainder in as proof? My dad because the papers were shredded and covered in rat urine. I teach, had pet rats in the classroom, and totally believe you. My bio teacher told me this story. During a biology lesson they were outside. My school is near a small lake. A student ended up falling in and getting their legs stuck in the mud. The bio teacher had to rescue them and hose them off behind the school. The next period teacher didn't believe them despite the student being soaking wet. What's with all these stories of students going to their next class soaking wet? If something like that happened in my school, the kid would either go home or get new clothes brought to the school. Nobody wants a soggy kid in their classroom. I was a student. It was the first day of school. There were 6 of us who were late. The reason the school bus stop was moved to a new location. We all piled into my mother's car. We went to the principal's office. The office manager said notice letters were sent to us, so she checked her log. The notices were never sent out. See, it says right here the notices were sent out on date pending. I typed your symptoms into the thing up here and it says you could have network connectivity problems. I didn't come to school because I was in Mexico at my hypnotist. Yeah, I didn't think one would take a day trip to Mexico for a hypnotist and be back the next day, but that was in fact what had happened. You were hypnotized? Not a teacher, but I'm from a small town, and one day like half of my high school was late because a senior decided on his last day he was going to ride his ride-on lawnmower to school and cut off Daisy Dukes and a cowboy hat. There's one main access road to the school. He backed shit up for like half an hour between buses and cars. You won't be surprised to know that he goes by the nickname Bubba. Every Friday of his senior year, Joey drove his John Deere to school. I don't believe that they still use that one for working, but it made a 30-mile round trip once a week. One of the girls I know from uni works in a college here. College is a name for vocational school, and one of her groups of students jokingly said they died when someone was absent from classes. So one day it went morbidly wrong when she asked why. Say, Dave was absent. The group replied that he died. She laughed and said okay, but seriously, and the class was just silent. Edit for additional clarity. Yes, it turned out that Dave was dead, for real this time. Very dead. I've had a few. I'll be 2 weeks late for class because I'll be in Beijing at the Olympics. My father was murdered. I was deported last night. Funny story about the last excuse. One day, this great guy in my PE class completely disappears for like half the year. Nobody could reach him, he wasn't responding to any phones, messages, DMs, etc., and part of his family was gone too. Even the teachers were puzzled and worried. So he comes back some time later and we all joke around about how he was deported. Well, turns out he actually did get deported. For some reason, they mistook his family for illegal immigrants and detained them for a month, then sent them to the Dominican. His family was half Puerto Rican, half Mexican, so it made no sense why they were sent to the drive, and at the very least, he himself was also a U.S. citizen. His family filed to go back to the USA immediately. I gave this one. I was in college. I went back to my house between classes only to find my roommates barricaded inside by police. Why, you might ask. There was a bull moose in our side yard and the fish and game people were very concerned. So my lab isn't until 3 or something, and meanwhile there's like 8 officers having a standoff with the moose in my yard. This continues until someone decides that the moose is an imminent threat and they're going to try to tranquilize it. So they try that and it fails. So now they're going to kill the moose. It gets to be about 2:45 and I need to leave for my class and am summarily informed by the armed officer that my lawn is not safe and am to stay inside. So I emailed my professor and was like, look, I know you're not going to believe this, but I'm barricaded in my house and they won't let me leave. I assume this will be on the news tonight. Turns out it was on the news. They interviewed me, and I got an exemption on that lab. He told me later that he was going to 100% fail me because it was the worst excuse ever until he saw the news story. In case it wasn't immediately obvious, yes, this occurred in Vermont, because where else would this be a problem? As a graduate TA for undergrad students, I was teaching an online course and all assignments had to be submitted by midnight. A student emailed me this is important and said her internet was down and she couldn't submit the paper. As in logged into her email on the internet to email me that her internet was down. The way the class was run, if she didn't submit the paper by midnight she got a 0 for the assignment. I replied to her email, remember, her internet is down, that if she brought me a hard copy of the paper she could still get her grade. She shows up at my apartment 10 minutes later. I hosted study groups in the community room with her hard copy paper and a half-melted internet router. She had emailed me from her smartphone that she had for her internship. This was early in the smartphone surge and few people had them. Girl got her grade and we're still in touch. She proved herself to be an incredibly dedicated student and is now in graduate school herself. I had a student miss class because one of his coworkers at his job had been arrested for child pornography and management needed him to cover the shift the guy was supposed to work before he was arrested. The student brought in proof too. Thankfully not in the form of CP. I had a professor who would have thrown a bitch fit about that. He would say that school comes before work and that you should be more professional and blah blah blah. Like, geez dude, I'm sorry you were never poor? If it's not your regular shift or appended to your regular shift right after, there's always the option of telling the boss you're too drunk to come in. I had a student who told me he was going to miss one of the exams because he was visiting a famous rapper in Florida with his family. He told me that the rapper, who at the time was a relatively big deal, all over the radio, was his cousin and his family was flying out for a show and he couldn't skip it. I mean, I would have let him make up the exam anyway, I don't really care as long as he takes it. But all his peers and I were kind of like, yeah, right, okay, whatever you say man. He was telling the truth. When he got back from Florida, said famous rapper Skyped into our poetry class and chatted with my students about poetry and lyrics and such. It was actually really cool. Not a teacher, but a fellow student in my grad program last week. Sorry, I have to go. I just got a notification that my TV fell on my cat.